Perhaps we need some outside universal threat to make us recognize this common bound. I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world. And yet, I ask you, is not an alien force already among us? What could be more alien to the universal aspirations of our peoples than war and the threat of war?
Flying saucers, where do they come from? This is the title of a recent book on the subject of UFOs, or unidentified flying objects. And the author is Sydney businessman Mr. Richard Tambling, who claims to have had several sightings of UFOs. Mr. Tambling was an RAF photographer and an expert in aircraft recognition. Now, in the preface of this book, Mr. Tambling, you say that now that the existence of UFOs is gaining widespread acceptance, the question is, where do they come from?
Last October, in the quiet Mississippi town of Pascagoula, two local men confronted authorities with a rather bizarre story. Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker told of a strange craft landing near their fishing site and of being taken aboard by three unearthly creatures. The two men were questioned under hypnosis and lie detectors, but their story remained intact.
I'm going to step off the limb now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Good evening. A flying saucer landing on the steps of Sydney Town Hall. Fact or fiction? Well, that scene was fiction from the ABC children's serial The Strangers, but there are some people who claim it's a fact that flying saucers have landed here.
I guess that was when I heard it. It was some kind of zipping sound, and when I turned around in this area out here, about 40 or 50 feet out there, there was some kind of craft, you know. It looked like it's going to come right onto the ground. The blue light, it had blue flashing lights as it was, you know, approaching the ground, but then they went out, and when the opening appeared, some source of light came from the inside. It was just almost blinding.
So I looked out the window at the top, and naturally I saw this object above.
Tony, this is so great you can't believe it. I believe it, Charlie. It's raining, Charlie. Okay, let's go, would you, Charlie? You got all your steering, it's great. Oh, this is going to be some kind of different ride.
I think maybe I'd answer it this way. I keep, in my frustration sometimes, you know, actually, if you count some of the things going on in smaller countries and all, there have been about 114 wars since World War II. But I've often wondered, what if all of us in the world discovered that we were threatened by a power from outer space, from another planet? Wouldn't we all of a sudden find that we didn't have any differences between us at all? We were all human beings, citizens of the world, and wouldn't we come together to fight?
Mr. Tambling, you say here in your book that it's only a matter of time before the strangers from the skies come to know us better. Now, are you suggesting some kind of invasion from outer space?
This is quite possible. I don't think in the sense that we would think of it, but people coming, yes.
This guy says the Old Testament, written in Hebrew, taught him how to summon UFOs. All right, he says he can also do this on command, and he adds he's been doing it for 25 years.
We met up with Prophet Yahweh, seer of Yahweh, at Doolittle Park off Lake Mead. We picked the day, we picked the time, and we picked the location. When the prophet started praying for a sighting, I wasn't exactly convinced.
Look at it, there it is.
You can barely see it, a white speck. Then, another sighting.
There it is, I got it.
Photojournalist Jonathan Hawkins locks in on it. Let's take a closer look here. It's an orange sphere that appeared out of nowhere. I call the boss with an unexpected change in my story. I can see it clear as day. In fact, it's bright.
That's a UFO for sure.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
Oh, whoa. What is that?
There's a new video this morning that some say may be proof we're not alone in the universe. A UFO in the form of a bright light is seen descending over the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem.
The Pentagon recently formed a new office to study UFO reports, and now it's NASA's turn. The space agency launching a new team to investigate who or what may be behind the
Hippity hoppity, hippity hopping over hill after hill.
I cannot imagine a more sensational and exciting conspiracy theory than the one about a big giant cover-up regarding the existence of extraterrestrials and UFOs and life on other planets. I mean, even coming from a guy who makes controversial documentaries about satanic cults and secret societies and end-time prophecies, and everything in between. So as somebody who is well acquainted with the occult aspects of this reality, the implications of a supposed alien visitation concept are enormous. If it were true, it would eclipse everything else that I talk about on this channel. I mean, what could be more important? What could possibly be more groundbreaking than the revelation that humankind is only one of many intelligent civilizations in our universe? And in the case that any of these other intelligent life forms were actually visiting Earth and making contact with humans, well then such creatures would obviously be far superior to humankind in terms of intelligence and technological ability. And so if that were true, and if that were revealed to the masses, it would just change everything. I know, speaking on behalf of Christians, we would be forced to rectify the differences between what the Bible says about creation and the alleged existence of intelligent beings who are somehow superior to the ones who were made in the image of God. Not to mention that these aliens would likely come with stories of, humanity's origins and possibly seeding the galaxies with life and, all the theories that are out there. And you can scoff at this now, but will your faith be shaken when you turn on the news and the number one story is the aliens have arrived? Because those who trust in the testimony of the Bible will be challenged to put faith before sight. Because if my expectations are correct, then what we're going to see unfold in this world will defy all tradition and conventional wisdom. And for the Christian, you will be required to either refute all of this evidence that's being revealed and just to embrace your faith, or to accept all of this alleged evidence and facts and in turn abandon your faith. But you just simply cannot accept a literal interpretation of the book of Genesis and come away with the idea that God created not only the heavens and the earth, but also millions and billions of other planets that could potentially foster life, in millions and billions of different galaxies and even a bunch of different universes. I'm not saying that God couldn't do this, and I'm not even saying that God didn't do that, but it certainly is not how the Bible describes the heavens. And you also can't rationalize the existence of these superior races on different planets if you trust the Bible, which says that God created everything in 6 days, 5 of which pertain specifically to Earth, mind you. And then he breathed the breath of life into human beings, after all. And how about Jesus, who was born on Earth and who is coming back to Earth? And if the Earth is such an important part of God's creation, as the Bible describes it to be, then why the heck doesn't the Bible mention the supposed fact that Earth is actually only one of an incalculable amount of planets spread throughout billions of galaxies, And again, according to conventional astronomy, a lot of these other planets apparently could foster life just like here on Earth.
By 2010, Kepler had reported data on all but 400 of the 150,000 target stars. Out of these, 706 were reported to have viable exoplanet candidates, with sizes going from the size of Earth to much larger than Jupiter. February 2nd, 2011, they made some groundbreaking announcements. Out of the potential candidates, the Kepler team noted 1,235 that were a size close enough to Earth that potential habitation could be considered. 54 of these finds were reported to be possibly within the habitable zone.
And sometimes the conditions would be even more ideal for life. And then the likelihood of other intelligent life within that vast amount of space would be almost absolute. So did Jesus also die to atone for their sins as well? And so this idea of space travel and alien civilizations that exist elsewhere in the universe, it's all just really inconsistent with the way that creation is described in the Bible. Now, if you're a non-believer, on the other hand, that doesn't invest your faith in what the Bible says, well, then the existence of intelligent aliens all over this universe is not only probable, but almost definite. I mean, we're talking about an almost infinitely vast amount of space that's just filled with hundreds of billions of galaxies, and each galaxy contains over 100 billion planets, they say. How could planet Earth, a tiny planet by comparison, be the only place in the entire universe where intelligent life exists? And supposing the Big Bang were true, and supposing Darwinian evolution was also true, well then how stupid would you have to be to suggest that planet Earth, a mere grain of sand in the seabed of the universe, could be the only one to contain civilized society? And so the probability of the existence of these extraterrestrial beings of superior intelligence is actually really high according to the laws of evolution, and I think just scientific expectation according to how the world perceives life to have started. And I would know, because there was a time where I considered myself to be somewhat of an expert concerning the topic of aliens and UFOs. I was truly captivated by that idea. In fact, it's sort of what introduced me into this world of conspiracy and secret agendas. I must have read about 50 books or more on the topic of aliens. I went in expecting sort of fun campfire stories, but what I found instead was just a whole bunch of solid evidence that the governments of this world were engaged in a cover-up regarding some type of alien agenda. And studying this topic is sort of what taught me how to research confidential materials as well. Like finding information via the Freedom of Information Act, and just how to scour through the internet, and certain keywords and all that kind of stuff, That's where it sort of taught me that. And as I studied these things, just countless books and documentaries and websites, and just sifting through stacks of declassified evidence and witness testimony, and I was just astonished to discover how much of this stuff was actually founded in reality. Who could refute such a massive collection of corroborating evidence? And yet, it would certainly appear that it was all being covered up, by the government and by the media. But was it being covered up? On one hand, it really is true that the media at that time would tend to downplay events like UFO sightings or supposed alien abductions. Every report was always accompanied by the X-Files theme music and presented with as little seriousness as possible. And it's also common knowledge that, at least historically speaking, reports of UFOs and alien abductions and these types of things have generally been disregarded by the US government, at least when it comes to their public stance on the matter. Denial always just kind of seemed to be the official government position.
So why didn't he say anything then? Partly, he says, because he didn't want people to panic.
I think as a public figure you have to be very careful about what you say, because people can have pretty emotional reactions, and I said my goal wasn't to try to stir the pot.
And he went to humorous and controversial lengths not to stir the pot. He held a news conference after the Phoenix Lights to announce the mystery had been solved.
And now I'll ask Officer Stein and his colleagues to escort the accused into the room so that we may all look upon the guilty party. Don't get him too close to me, please.
In the alien costume, the governor's chief of staff.
Now, this just goes to show that you guys are entirely too serious.
UFO enthusiasts were not amused.
And so I was already well aware that our government had long denied having any information or evidence of life on other planets before I even began researching it for myself. But as I began to uncover all these official government documents and references related to extraterrestrials, I was naturally shocked, and I soon became convinced that the governments of our world were indeed engaged in a full-on cover-up of this phenomenon. I was coming across entire archives and volumes of reported sightings, abductions, and even extraterrestrial communications from credible and high-ranking politicians and military officials, and all ranging over a period of more than 50 years. And there were all these reports and testimonies from important key figures which literally detail things like the retrieval of alien technology from crashed flying saucers.
Headline edition, July 8, 1947. The Army Air Forces has announced that a flying disc has been found and is now in the possession of the Army. Army officers say the missile, found sometime last week, has been inspected at Roswell, New Mexico, and sent to Wright Field, Ohio, for further inspection. Late this afternoon, a bulletin from New Mexico suggested that the widely publicized mystery of the flying saucers may soon be solved. Army Air Force officers reported that one of the strange discs had been found and inspected sometime last week. Our correspondents in Los Angeles and Chicago have been in contact with Army officials endeavoring to obtain all possible late information. Joe Wilson reports to us now from Chicago.
Anyone familiar with UFO lore will recognize at least some of what Phil Corso says. Reports of crashed saucers, recovered alien bodies, a government cover-up. But in 50 years of UFO controversy, no one of his rank or stature has ever publicly proclaimed this level of inside knowledge. Corso was an intelligence officer inside the Eisenhower White House, assigned to the National Security Council. He also served as Inspector General of the 7th Army and commanded the 1st Nuclear Battalion in Germany. His credentials are impeccable, his record spotless. But did he really handle wreckage from a flying saucer?
They came from a flying saucer.
How do you know that?
Because they were marked on the files as coming from New Mexico.
Roswell.
Yeah, it's Roswell.
Philip J. Corso, a former member of President Eisenhower's National Security Council from the years 1953 through 1957. And he was also the chief of the Foreign Technology Division of the Army Research and Development Department at the Pentagon, which, by the way, if there really was a such thing as a crashed flying saucer, a lot of people think that that would, end up in the Smithsonian or that it would be front page news. No, if that were to happen in real life, the first place it would go, at least if it happened here in America, would be to, the Research and Development Department at the Pentagon. So you just can't get a much more credible and qualified witness than Philip J. Corso when it comes to government knowledge of an extraterrestrial presence on Earth. And Corso published a book in 1997 called The Day After Roswell, wherein he claimed that during his tenure as the head of foreign technology for the U.S. Army, he was assigned the duty of handling and studying these fragments of alien technology that were retrieved from a crashed alien spacecraft in Roswell, New Mexico in 1947, the famous Roswell incident. And that while these materials were in his stewardship, he created a task force to conduct a reverse engineering project, which would study these alien technologies, and analyze its potential for earthly applications, specifically military applications. And according to Corso, it was through this reverse engineering of the crashed spacecraft in Roswell that mankind achieved many modern technological advancements, including lasers and fiber optics, and even integrated circuit chips, which obviously have come to change the world and enabled the advent of the computer age that now defines our culture. And in his book, The Day After Roswell, Corso made many more incredible claims, which included detailed descriptions of both the crashed spacecraft, and also the alien creatures within the wreckage. And of course, when the book was published in 1997, it was largely received with ridicule and denial, by many media sources. But it was also praised and endorsed by others. But what I found uniquely compelling is the fact that Corso wrote and released this book within the very last years of his life. It was published in 1997, and Corso passed away in 1998 at the age of 83. So this practically renders his book to be a form of deathbed confession, in a way, And it seems unlikely that a highly respected and accomplished former Pentagon official would choose to create a giant hoax in his last days of life, compromising his reputation and becoming a target of ridicule. It seems more likely that if it were true that you spent the last 50 years, guarding such a deep secret and having to tell so many lies to the people you love, it seems reasonable that on your deathbed you might choose to tell the truth, and to confess the thing that you've been covering up. And so I just think those are compelling conditions to consider. But Corso wasn't the only highly credible witness of these secret operations to make a deathbed confession about it. There was also Boyd Bushman. And I know, what a name, right? But he was the senior engineer of Lockheed Martin, and he made similar claims of alien contact and being commissioned by the government to participate in reverse engineering programs, much like the one described by Corso. And then there was also Lieutenant Walter Haut, the press relations officer at the military base in Roswell, New Mexico, at the time of the infamous Roswell incident. And he also made public admissions about the aliens being real and that the crash really happened, as well as that it was all covered up. And, he made these confessions shortly before his death as well. And there's even more examples than this, but let's move on. Because this is just a small sampling from a vast pool of extremely interesting and compelling evidence suggesting that there really is a government cover-up of these aliens and UFOs, or whatever you want to call it. And the 20-year-old version of me was just totally riveted and captivated and compelled by all these official and legitimate revelations that I was coming across. In fact, I was so invested in this topic of research that I actually considered applying to become what was called a field investigator for MUFON, which stands for the Mutual UFO Network. And they're kind of like the official organization devoted to the research and investigation of this UFO stuff. And then this field of research, by the way, at least back then, was referred to as ufology. It's cringy, I know. As if you can just add the suffix ology to the end of a word and suddenly it becomes an academically credible field of study, And of course, so any researchers within the field of ufology would therefore be called a ufologist, which does not reduce the cringe level at all. But, that's what we called it. And I was sort of an amateur ufologist, I guess, one of the unpaid variety. And this was back when I was, again, in my early 20s, and I was into this pretty deep. I participated in numerous groups and websites related to UFOs, and studying this stuff was really exciting for me. I really felt like I was always on the verge of uncovering some great mystery. And within my small library of UFO-themed literature, I had no less than 3 different signed copies of books by nuclear physicist Stanton Friedman. He was my favorite ufologist. He was highly esteemed among his peers, due to his academic credentials and professional credibility. A rocket scientist who became somewhat of a pioneer in ufology. And he was kind of like the Michael Jordan of this fringe community. And one time in the summer of 2009, Friedman was scheduled to give a presentation in the nearby town of Burlington, Wisconsin. And I took the day off of work so that I could attend his presentation, and just shake the guy's hand. After all, he was in his late 70s at that time, and I was kind of thinking I might not really have many more chances to meet him, supposing I wanted to do that. And he would also commonly call for younger people to get involved in the field for the sake of continuity of his research. And so I had this whole pitch prepared, to offer to volunteer my assistance in any way that he might have use for me. And so I was really excited for this opportunity, not just to meet Stanton Friedman, but also to volunteer my services and see if maybe Friedman couldn't usher me into this world of ufology, But on my way to the event, I got a call from work about some emergency staffing situation. And I was the store manager at that time, so I really had no choice but to go to work and to address the situation. And I was just so ticked off. I was just fuming. I could not believe that something like this would come up at this time on that day. And I decided that I wouldn't give up that easy, So I continued driving to the event, and I devised a plan that I would go in early, I would buy some of Stanton Friedman's books, I would ask for his signature, and that's when I would drop my pitch on him, And then I would race to work and get back to my responsibilities. But when I finally got to the event and went inside, he wasn't there. There were people at his desk, at his little info table, and they told me that he was having lunch at a local diner before his presentation. And so I cursed under my breath and proceeded to purchase his newest book. And I started making my way back to the car, but then I decided that I was too close to give up. And so I actually drove to the restaurant that he was supposedly eating at, and I parked in the parking lot. And I knew that approaching Mr. Friedman at his table while he was eating could be construed as a rude gesture, but I hoped that he would be impressed by my determination to meet him, even in spite of these inconvenient circumstances. And so I decided I was going to go for it, So I park my car, I grab my book, I exit my car, and I start walking toward the entrance of this restaurant, kind of revising the pitch in my head, to accommodate these unusual terms that I was going to be meeting him on. And then I started doing what I always do. I got nervous. I started doubting myself and second-guessing the whole thing. And I was pondering all the different ways that he might dismiss me or be annoyed. And whenever I fall into these types of anxiety attacks, it becomes a bit of a struggle to keep a calm composure. Something I'm getting a lot better at now, but it's just always been a struggle for me. And so, in my anxious state, I didn't realize that I had been pacing around the parking lot for quite a while at that point. And I probably looked like a crazy man to any onlookers that might be watching me through the restaurant windows. And surely Stanton Friedman himself was sitting next to a window and probably watching me all along with pity and amusement. And I just ended up fleeing the scene in embarrassment. And I just went back to work, and I continued my little life as a shoe store manager. And I always kind of regretted my lack of confidence on that day. But that's the story. And now you might have found that story to be kind of pointless in context with the subject of this documentary, and you would be right about that. But I just think it helps illustrate not only my strange and frantic personality, but also how passionate I once was about this topic of UFOs and ETs. And I want you to understand that the claims that I'm going to be making in this documentary are not based on some loosely held or flippant opinions of mine. This is the culmination of years of research in a topic that I once took very seriously. And another thing I should mention in this introduction is a disclaimer that this documentary series will make a lot of people uncomfortable. And a lot of people are just going to laugh and mock me in the comments section. But that's okay. As my wife would say, I'm used to it. But the point is, I'm prepared to even lose some subscribers over this one. Because not only is this documentary series going to be detailing the controversial nature of this whole extraterrestrial alien agenda conspiracy, but in this documentary series, I will be calling the very existence of outer space into question. Not the outer space that you see with your naked eyes as you look out into the night sky, but the outer space that exists as the result of the Big Bang that we have learned about from modern and conventional astronomy. And so I expect a lot of pushback, especially from my non-Christian viewers who don't accept the Bible to be God's perfect word. And to you guys, I love you, but you just simply cannot make sense out of these major deceptions and worldwide agendas without viewing it through the scope of spiritual warfare and biblical prophecy, in my opinion. But for those of you who do believe the Bible to be the Word of God, let this film series challenge the strength of your faith in a literal interpretation of God's Word. Too many professing Christians have been taught to bend their knee to the scientific consensus of this world, even where it clashes with what the Bible clearly teaches. Most Christians have no problem dismissing every single piece of evidence that secular science claims to be proof of Darwinian evolution. But have you really considered the implications of what it takes to deny the theory of evolution? In doing so, you are willfully rejecting the research and expertise of the scientific majority. And you are practically accusing the leading institutions of our society of engaging in a worldwide conspiracy to suppress the truth of creation and to indoctrinate humanity with this fabricated propaganda. That's a pretty bold accusation to make. You would have to be a conspiracy theorist to believe something like that, right? Well, and yet most Christians are comfortable to simply dismiss the scientific consensus when it comes to evolution. But for some reason, a lot of Christians are not willing to expand this skepticism beyond evolution. We confidently scoff at the science textbooks which claim that the universe is billions of years old, but then we turn around and accept everything else in the text. We accept the existence of these spinning planets and solar systems and galaxies, despite our willingness to deny the very Big Bang by which the existence of these things relies on. So it's this doublethink, and I think that another area of Christian doublethink is in regard to the supernatural. And I think that this is especially true among my fellow American Protestant brothers and sisters. We've become so jaded from seeing all these charlatans and televangelists with their phony miracles and blasphemous healing revivals that we begin to doubt, and we thereby stifle or muddle our ability to fully realize and properly discern the supernatural forces at play around us. And even though we fully believe the biblical depictions of demonic possession and the casting out of demons, the way it's described in the New Testament, we tend to just accept whatever the scientific consensus claims is going on around us. So in the case of that demonic possession, these days I'm sure it would be described as mental illness. And my point here is that we as believers, we have been conditioned to accept these secular explanations for things that are actually spiritual in nature. But sometimes what is spiritual in nature collides with what is physical in nature. Sometimes angels and demons manifest in physical bodies. According to the Bible, angels can sometimes descend from the skies in what is described as heavenly chariots and majestic wheels. And then when we get into the revelations of John, we see that there's a great war that's going to eventually happen in heaven. A battle between the angels and the dragon. And this, of course, is after the tribulation period, wherein we see famine and earthquakes and so on, as God's wrath is poured out onto earth. And we see the whole world uniting under the dictatorship of the Antichrist. And of course, when you envision the end times, you imagine fires raining down from the heavens and blood in the streets and natural disasters happening left and right. And of course, you have what the Bible describes as the beasts coming into power. And despite the fact that most theologians believe these beasts to be described metaphorically, and by the way, I happen to agree with that, but I just think that it's hard to read through all these biblical end-time prophecies and to read through the book of Revelation and fail to recognize that much of what is written is depicted literally. And as I study these things that I study, I often ponder, how will the secular world react to all these amazing events that are described in Revelation, and elsewhere in the Bible? Because while you and I and our fellow believers might understand that we're watching the fulfillment of biblical prophecies unfold, we just know that CNN would be blaming the fireballs and earthquakes on climate change, and the lawlessness in the streets will be blamed on guns, and the famines would be blamed on food shortages, plagues will be disguised as pandemics, and then the arrival of these heavenly beings will be described probably as aliens from outer space. And as somebody with a modestly extensive background in the research of UFOs and extraterrestrials, who has since become a born-again Christian, I am exceedingly confident that this world is about to start seeing some really strange things in our skies. And there's going to be an increase in alien abduction claims, which closely resemble the description of demonic possession, by the way. And I believe that when this event occurs, it will be used by the governments of this world as the justification to seal the unification of their one-world government under the guise of coming together against a larger common threat. And in this documentary series, I hope to give you a biblical context for what I believe you're going to start seeing unfold in the real world around us. And I won't be debunking the existence of aliens or UFOs. Actually, it's to the contrary. I will attempt to prove to you that both aliens and UFOs really do exist. It's just that they're not what Hollywood and what all these CIA psyops are telling us they are. Because I believe that the Bible tells us exactly what they are. And I believe that the Bible even tells us exactly why they're here. You know that the devil is operating according to a strategy, right? And as the wicked ruler of this fallen world, what if his strategy was to utilize the authoritative institutions of this world to discredit the Bible? Wouldn't that be consistent with prophecy? Institutions like science and education. What if you could use the prestige of such institutions to cast doubt on the truth of God's word? What if he used the mystique of complicated scientific jargon to confuse people into doubting their own intuition? Would we welcome the arrival of physical demons or false messiahs that presented themselves as extraterrestrials who came in peace? I know that this all sounds crazy, and I cringe to think about how many of my old subscribers are now questioning my intelligence. But if you can't tell, I'm really not very concerned about making friends or fitting in. I'm only interested in following what is true. And when you seek the truth, one of the first things that you're going to learn is that our culture in this fallen world has been built on a foundation of lies. And I think that Christians of all people should understand this. I will never understand why so many professing Christians continue to invest trust and confidence into these worldly institutions and traditions. Again, Christians, by and large, have no problem rejecting the theory of evolution in regard to the origin of mankind, simply because it contradicts what the Bible says. Even despite the fact that an estimated 97% of the so-called scientific community accepts evolution as the dominant scientific theory of biological diversity. And we see the way that Darwinian evolution is practically presented as factual in today's public school curriculum.
Creationism, but that's not science.
It is now.
Evolution is widely acknowledged as scientific fact. It's even accepted by prominent conservatives like George Will and the late Pope John Paul.
Here's something to think about.
You know, and we're baffled as that very same so-called scientific community has gone on to redefine gender and to dehumanize preborn babies as being nothing more than an inhuman fetus, you know, and we know that the scientific community affirms all of this woke nonsense. And we see how they've propagated this whole global warming thing or overpopulation and so on. And most Christians seem to accept and affirm the premise that when it comes to these topics that I just mentioned, the systems of this world are engaged in a massive conspiracy, you know, to deceive and to indoctrinate society. But somehow we turn around and trust the credibility of this same so-called scientific community when it comes to everything else. What if the so-called scientific community was really just a code word for government-funded scientific institutions? And what if it really was a satanic government that intended to hide God? Wouldn't that be a great method to deceive and to control public perception? Supposing, of course, that you intended to do something so sinister. Because these suggestions may sound to you like the ravings of a conspiracy nut, but, you know, there's a historical precedent for this type of thing. I mean, aren't we told to trust the science? You know, as if we all have our own laboratories where we can reproduce the results of these experiments and projects to verify the accuracy of whatever's being claimed by the scientific community? As if we actually have the time to file through all the white papers and read all of the necessary books, you know, that would be required to verify any of this information for ourselves. No, we don't do that. These atheistic-minded people will tell you that they believe the science, when what they really mean is that they believe the scientific claims being reported in scientific books. And ironically, their worldview is hinged on their own faith that these books are accurate, reliable, and honest. But meanwhile, they're going to turn around and scoff at the Christian who puts his faith in the ancient wisdom of the Bible, you know, another book. And I know I say it all the time, but everybody is operating according to faith in something. And I don't care what anyone else has ever told you. I mean, for a skeptic on the fence, the debate really could be boiled down to a simple contest of credibility between the ancient scriptures and modern textbooks. You know, in both cases, we're relying on the testimony of others. And in the case of the Bible, which is not merely a book, mind you, but a library of 66 books that were written over a period of 1,500 years by over 40 different authors on 3 different continents in 3 different languages, and yet when compiled together, they all relay a consistent and corroborative message. And I sort of gleaned that definition of the Bible's history from Bodhi Bacham, who also went on to say this.
Now let's unpack this. First of all, the Bible is a reliable collection of historical documents. Look at what he says here in verse 16. For we did not follow cleverly devised tales when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. We did not follow cleverly devised tales. We did not follow myths or fairy tales or legends. We did not follow things that were made up. Luke puts it this way in his prologue. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile an account of the things accomplished among us, just as they were passed down to us by those who were beforehand eyewitnesses and servants of the word, it seemed fitting to me, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, to write it out for you in consecutive order, most excellent Theophilus, so that you might believe God on blind faith. No, so that you might know the exact truth about the things you have been taught. We have a reliable collection of historical documents. Not myths, not fairy tales, not legends. This is not the Gilgamesh epic here. These are things that actually transpired in history and were recorded for us. Not only do we have a reliable collection of historical documents, but they were written down by eyewitnesses during the lifetime of other eyewitnesses. Look at what he says. But we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. We saw.
And this is where I'm going to end part 1, because as you can see, we still have a lot of ground to cover. And as I mentioned earlier, this documentary will soon present a lot more information and evidence to further substantiate all these radical claims that I've been making regarding the true nature of so-called extraterrestrial life, as well as a lot of the propaganda that surrounds modern astronomy. But obviously, when it comes to challenging the public perception of something as monumental as the design of our universe, I can't just come in all guns blazing, you know? I understand that a whole lot of you will be predisposed to dismissing a lot of what I have to say on this topic, just for the simple fact that in your mind, the existence of outer space and our solar system and the Milky Way galaxy, you know, it's all a matter of proven fact. I mean, after all, NASA is comprised of the most intelligent and qualified mathematicians and engineers and rocket scientists within their fields. And they all seem to be in agreement about the conventional model of astronomy. And this crosses many borders. Every so-called spacefaring nation has its own space agency that's equivalent to NASA. And a lot of times they work in cooperation with one another to some degree, as we collectively advance in the technology required for space exploration and the science, involving outer space. And furthermore, all that knowledge and technology, which apparently has enabled space exploration, is bolstered in decades, if not centuries, of scientific literature from some of the greatest minds of our time. So in that context, I totally understand why a lot of you would be inclined to just preemptively disregard any challenges against such a well-established science, and seemingly irrefutable facts. And I also understand why a lot of you will just reject this at its premise. It just seems like too ridiculous of a conspiracy theory, that so many people across such a vast community of academics and scientists, and engineers and even governments worldwide could ever carry out such a massive deception. And even if they could, what would the motive possibly be? So I know that the very notion of such a conspiracy theory as this seems utterly ridiculous. And it also may seem pretty arrogant to a lot of you that a regular guy like me, who just works a regular job and who makes YouTube videos on his laptop, would have the audacity to publicly challenge the entire scientific and expert consensus about this stuff. Especially considering that I admittedly have no experience or a specialized education in the arena of astronomy. I'm not even good at math, but yet here I am challenging the accepted science. But not because I'm academically qualified to do so, and not because I have actually disproven any of their science myself. In fact, I kind of struggle to even comprehend the physics and mathematical equations that are used to demonstrate the composition of outer space. No, I'm coming into this debate armed with only one exhibit of solid evidence, and that's the Holy Bible. And so I hope you'll stick around for the next 2 parts of this documentary series, as I will attempt to defend and justify all these radical claims that I made here in part 1. But in the meantime, perhaps you could get a little bit ahead of the curve by looking into this stuff for yourself. But until then, I'm signing off. This is Tim from Fallen World Films.
In 1974, after being a 6th grade school teacher, I was introduced to the late Dr. Wernher von Braun, in the U.S. the father of rocketry. In my first meeting with him, during that first 3.5 hours, he said to me, "Carol, you will stop the weaponization of space." And I said, teachers don't stop until June. He said, "No, you have to understand, this is February. And we have to prevent the weaponization of space because there is a lie being told to everyone that the weaponization of space is now first being based upon the evil empire, the Russians. There are many enemies," he said, "against whom we're going to build this space-based weapon system. The first of whom was the Russians, which was existing at that time. Then there would be terrorists. Then there would be third world countries. Now we call them rogue nations or nations of concern. Then there would be asteroids."
NASA just crashed a $300 million spacecraft into an asteroid. Why? To save us from the apocalypse. Haven't you seen Armageddon?
And then he would repeat to me over and over, and the last card, the last card, the last card would be the extraterrestrial threat.